how does apocalyptic literature become so popular in the late Judean time period and the early Christian church? So I want to set the stage a bit, and it's going to help you, I think, if you're looking at things like, say, First and Second Peter, Jude, and especially the Book of Revelation, of understanding how these things came to be so popular and what they're actually trying to do. What's the apocalyptic message, essentially? And so we're going to look at it a little bit historically, not at the individual books so much this time, but in a future one we'll do that. But this time, just trying to understand how it comes to be to begin with. And if you look at the region of Mesopotamia and the history of the world in that place, there was sort of this windshield wiper effect that repeatedly happened in the region. Whether it was the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Kassites, the Assyrians, the Elamites, etc. There was this constant turnover of who's in charge and why. And so you would go from these periods that were essentially very peaceful. There were great economies. You could count on things happening and being there. There was government assistance. Your military was going to stand up to fight for you. You weren't really concerned about being raided or neighbors or anything like that. Everything was very ordered and regular in your life. And then suddenly all of this would come crashing down and someone else would be in charge of everything. And your entire life would go from this peaceful, serene setting to the set of Mad Max very quickly, where there was just crazy chaos. And until it eventually would settle down again, and there would be another period of tranquility and calm, and you could go back to life as normal again. Now, they might not happen inside of your lifetime, but nonetheless, this is what was happening there. There was this repeated cycle that was happening, and especially for the people who were in the Syro-Palestinian region, it's because the area there, the kings and the various leaders of those city-states never really became powerful enough to challenge the people in the surrounding areas. That area was always under the thumb of someone, whether it was Egypt in the south, or it was someone up in northern Mesopotamia like the Assyrians, or even from the southern area of Mesopotamia, Iran, someone like the Babylonians, or the Kassites, the Sumerians, whatever it may be. And those individuals would come in, take over, and there was these sweeping changes, right? And sometimes the way that the empire turned over, it wasn't as if you just said, well, you blinked your eyes and somebody else is in charge. Sometimes that did happen, but more often than not, what happened was that there were massive deaths, there were famines, there was starvation. People believed it to be the end of everything. They were all going to die. And, it was the end of the world, essentially, as they knew it. And in fact, inside that area from, say, the Zagros Mountains all the way over into the mountains in Anatolia, and then south all the way down into Egypt, right, in the area north of Sahara, that entire region was seen as the world, right? I mean, there's geographic boundaries that sort of limit your expansion beyond that, and the people who would be coming in from outside of those regions had to do that with rather small groups of people. There were raids and such, but nothing like the armies that marched on those regions from the various different city-states that were in charge there. And so you could see things go south very quickly and very badly. And it happened quite rapidly. Sometimes in just a matter of a couple of years, a new empire would take over and upset the previous empire. And that period of time when there was the resetting of everything was so severe that people who weren't in the important areas, say like the Syro-Palestinian area, these smaller city-states, they were just, told to pick a side, essentially. Or, somebody would show up. If Assyria shows up and says, hey, what's going on, guys? Well, you would say, oh, you're the great king. You're the one in charge, man. You tell me what's up, and if Egypt showed up, you were like, hey, you're in charge. You're the great king. And there were time periods where that actually was happening, where there was this back and forth, and people changed sides very rapidly, very quickly, because they were afraid to die. And the end of the world for them was essentially imminent. And the early prophets, the early Judean and Hebrew prophets, were capturing this essentially in little fits and starts within the prophetic literature. You see that kind of language in, say, Jeremiah or Amos, and these prophets were capturing what would happen when a northern army would come in, and the terribleness of all these things, and but the timelessness rather of their culture in general, that we're going to survive, we're going to make it out of this thing. You and I, because of our faith in our God, we're going to make it out, and that's essentially what the prophets were saying. But the people who were evil and wicked, they're going to be judged. Now, out of that turmoil comes, literature like Daniel, for instance, which, captures the imagination because of the kind of language that it uses. And this is especially true as time marches on, and we end up with something like First Enoch. You end up with, by the way, First, Second, and Third Enoch, and there was a time period there where this thing was all being put together, but I won't get into the details of that, other than to say you see the calling out of those who were wicked and those who were against us. It was always the us versus them, and it gave a sense, I think, of hope in the middle of chaos. So if you can imagine, your world comes crashing down, and you pick up this book, and it tells you, in very flowery, exotic kinds of language, that it's going to be okay at the end, because God's going to be there to meet our needs. We're going to be restored. We're going to be rescued, and the evil will be punished for what they do. So you shouldn't get involved with the mess and the evil and the empire and all of these other things. There were essentially warnings for them to stay out of that, and to understand that God would be there to rescue them, and that those empires don't last. And really, that bears out in history, right? They may last for a long time, sometimes even hundreds of years, but nevertheless, they fall, and someone else is in charge. The empire is not going to be there forever, but we will. That's the sense that's being portrayed by that. And so we see that again in Daniel, and then in Enoch, and that comes out in various different Christian sources too. We have like the Apocalypse of Peter and of Barnabas and of Paul, and we have books like Jude, by the way, who cites from the book of Enoch, and we have First and Second Peter, which some people see allusions to the book of Enoch in there, which may or may not be true, but it's certainly affected the culture at large, and we'll get into that when we deal with that book at a later time. But and also the book of Revelation, right? Because that's really what's happening here. It's repurposing and picturing history in a different way. If someone just laid out the facts and said, hey, this is the way things are, this empire that's in charge right now, this is the way that it's going to work out. These guys are going to come in, and then something's going to happen, and they're going to fall, and someone else will take over, and then God will rescue us again. And if you're very bland about that, people don't really pay attention to that. If you want to be noticed, you had to be sort of really different and kind of out there. And they did this with symbolic and figurative language. I could think of a modern way of this kind of writing, and that's with C.S. Lewis. So, say the Chronicles of Narnia, for instance. The Chronicles of Narnia is really just a retelling of the gospel itself, but it's doing it, with this fantastic, otherworldly kind of land called Narnia, right? And there's creatures there like Mr. Tomness, right? Who you're not sure what kind of creature that really is. And all of these kinds of things are interacting with one another to tell you the same story. And that's really what apocalyptic literature is doing. So if we don't understand that, then what ends up happening is that we latch onto it and we want to think about it very literally and very woodenly. And before you know it, we end up with crazy kinds of understandings about the way that the world's going to be. When the person who's writing it really didn't intend that at all. For instance, C.S. Lewis didn't intend to think that you could actually go through a wardrobe in a home and meet up with Mr. Tumnus next to a streetlight in a faraway distant land, right? That's just not feasible. That's not what he thought. He was capturing something else, and it was symbolic for other things. And that's really what was happening with the prophets, and included in the prophetic literature, and especially so in apocalyptic literature. I think of someone else that's the same time period, for instance, of C.S. Lewis, and that's Tolkien, right? So if you look at, say, The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, all these different stories that he composed were about these other lands and other worlds, but in the background of all that, there is still that good versus evil struggle there. And I think both Tolkien and Lewis were trying to convey the same message, but Lewis was much more direct, and Tolkien was indirect. In fact, he chides Tolkien. I'm sorry, he chides Lewis for doing that, and he's saying the sign of a good writer is not having to be so direct. And that isn't a new thing, that's an old thing. And so if you understood this already from culture and you knew how people wrote about things and why, say, in the book of Revelation, who's the whore of Babylon, right? If Babylon isn't even an entity that's to be concerned about at the time of that writing, what is he talking about then? And how does that fit into my life? And so those are all questions that we get to ask when we look at this apocalyptic literature. But be that as it may, the reality is that when we're looking at apocalyptic literature, it's recapturing and repurposing the stories that they already knew in a different way that's more engaging. The prophets already would be rather odd, right? And we see this in various different prophets that were Hebrew prophets who would say lay on their side for a couple of weeks or whatever, eat bread that's cooked over dung, scream out from the top of the walls of the temple like Jeremiah. Or in the New Testament, we see somebody like John the Baptist who's, camping out in the wilderness, surviving off of locusts and wild honey, and with a camel hair garment, which is obviously, that would be extremely itchy and uncomfortable. And that's supposed to be part of the attraction of getting you to listen to the words that they have to say. And, it works. It's just a different way of telling the story. Instead of a narrative, it's still sometimes told in a narrative, but the language is so far-fetched and so far out there, it gets you to really think about the realities of good and evil and how that impacts the world. And so when we look at apocalyptic literature, those are the things that we should be thinking about. Not how does this literally work out in our world, but what are the spiritual implications? What are the theological implications that the author was trying to get me to see? And culturally, how does this make sense? Because it needed to make sense to the original hearers. If the original hearers of that particular work can't understand anything that they're saying, then it would make no sense for the author to ever write those things or for them to become popular to begin with. But the fact that they did survive means that enough people paid attention to it and did listen to it and did try to understand it, such that it was popular and they did get it. It did make sense in their culture. And so we have to go back to that and try to understand what is this telling? What was this telling the original people? Therefore, what is it telling me as I read it? If we want to get to the actual intent of the author. And if we don't do that, we end up with all sorts of crazy different movements. I think especially within the United States, say in the 1800s, the birth of many different cults, splinter groups of Christianity, predicting the end of the world, and where Jesus would return, and all of these different entities that developed were due to a lack of understanding of apocalyptic literature and trying to understand it in their own framework rather than the framework that existed at the time of the writing of that document, right? And that's the important issue. During the Protestant Reformation, for instance, you end up with, say, the Fifth Monarchist movement, which was extremely disruptive to society, and led to all sorts of problems within Europe. And eventually they got put down. They were trying to usher in the end of the world, and take over. And it didn't work out well for them. The various other cults within the United States, I think of, say, the Branch Davidians in Waco, or even Charles Manson with Helter Skelter, where he was going to bring about this final Armageddon, this final end of the world, after the conclusion of this great race war that he was going to initiate, which is obviously a problematic reading of that text. But people have been doing it and continue to do it still today. The most popular books about apocalyptic literature are extremely far-fetched, literal kinds of interpretations of these texts, which miss the point that the original authors were intending. And so I hope that as we look at some of these apocalyptic writings, that we can get to that and try to understand what the author really intended and why it would come out of that background. And the reason, again, that it came out of that background, I'll repeat myself, it's because of the way that the world worked. They regularly saw this. They saw empires rise and then fall and go out of existence, and their culture continue on. That was the nature of what it was like to live in that world. They saw the rawness of famine and plague and bloodshed and war, people being ripped away from them that they loved, and then also great times of peace. But it turns out, all the while, these great times of peace and tranquility, they were nothing but an illusion. And so you shouldn't trust in those things, though they won't get you through. But we have a solution. We have one that will get you through, and that's faith in our God. And that's what they were trying to communicate. And so I hope that as you follow along, that you'll be intrigued by this and you'll try to get to the root of really what these people were trying to say. Catch you guys next time.